The great libraries of Ashurbanipal have crumbled into dust, but the stories they preserved continue their patient work of illuminating human experience, offering comfort to the grieving, wisdom to the seeking, and companionship to all who find themselves alone with the eternal questions that consciousness brings. The clay tablets have returned to earth, but the conversations they made possible continue in every reader who discovers that the oldest human stories are also the newest, speaking with fresh relevance to each generation that encounters them with openness and wonder. The textual history of the Epic of Gilgamesh reveals a complex process of literary evolution that spanned more than 15 centuries, as different cultures and languages adapted the story to their own needs and perspectives. The earliest Sumerian poems about Gilgamesh were composed around 2100 BCE, but these were separate, independent stories rather than a unified narrative. 5 Sumerian poems survive in various states of preservation: Gilgamesh and Aga, Gilgamesh and the Bull of Heaven, Gilgamesh and Huawa, Gilgamesh, Enkidu and the Netherworld, and the Death of Gilgamesh. These early Sumerian poems already contain most of the elements that would later be woven together into the unified epic: the friendship with Enkidu, the journey to the cedar forest, the confrontation with Humbaba, the killing of the Bull of Heaven, and the quest for immortality. But in their original form, these were probably ritual or ceremonial poems, recited during religious festivals or royal celebrations, each complete in itself and serving specific cultural functions within Sumerian society. The transformation of these separate poems into a unified narrative began during the Old Babylonian period, around 1800 BCE, when Akkadian-speaking poets began creating longer, more psychologically complex versions of the Gilgamesh stories. The Old Babylonian version, preserved primarily on tablets from Sippar, Babylon and other Mesopotamian sites, represents the first attempt to create a coherent narrative arc that follows Gilgamesh's development from young warrior to mature king. The Old Babylonian version introduces several innovations that would become central to the epic tradition. The prologue that describes Gilgamesh's achievements and knowledge appears for the first time in this version, as does the sophisticated characterization of the friendship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu. The psychological realism that makes the epic so compelling to modern readers was largely developed during this period, as Babylonian poets explored the inner lives of their characters with unprecedented depth and subtlety. The Middle Babylonian period, roughly 1500 to 1200 BCE, saw further development of the epic tradition, with new episodes added and existing materials revised and expanded. Fragments from this period suggest that different cities and regions maintained their own versions of the epic, with variations that reflected local traditions and cultural preferences. Some versions emphasized the military and political aspects of Gilgamesh's kingship, while others focused more heavily on the philosophical and religious themes. The standard Babylonian version, compiled around 1200 BCE, represents the culmination of this long process of literary development. This version, preserved primarily in the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, became the canonical form of the epic and is the basis for most modern translations. The compiler of this version, traditionally identified as a scholar named Sinlekyunini, was not simply a copyist but was a creative editor who shaped disparate materials into a unified work of remarkable artistic achievement. Sinlekyunini's editorial work involved not only arranging existing materials into a coherent sequence, but also creating new passages that provided transitions between episodes and developed thematic connections that might not have been apparent in earlier versions. The sophisticated use of parallel episodes, recurring imagery, and circular structure that characterizes the standard version reflects editorial choices that transformed a collection of heroic tales into a profound meditation on human existence. The tablets containing the standard version were written in late Babylonian cuneiform, using a script and language that had evolved considerably from the earlier Sumerian and Old Babylonian sources. The scribes who copied these tablets were highly educated specialists who understood not only the technical aspects of writing, but also the literary and cultural significance of the texts they were preserving. Their work represents one of humanity's earliest systematic efforts to create definitive editions of important literary works. The library context in which these tablets were preserved tells us much about how the epic was valued and used in ancient Mesopotamian culture. The library of Ashurbanipal was not simply a storage facility for old texts, but was an active centre of learning and scholarship where texts were studied, compared, and interpreted by successive generations of scholars. The Epic of Gilgamesh was preserved alongside works on astronomy, mathematics, medicine, law, and religion, indicating that it was considered an important part of the intellectual and cultural heritage that educated people were expected to know. The physical characteristics of the tablets themselves provide insights into the care and resources devoted to preserving the epic. The tablets were made from carefully prepared clay, inscribed with precision and attention to aesthetic as well as functional considerations, and stored in organised archives that allowed for easy retrieval and consultation. The investment of time, skill and materials required to produce and maintain these tablets indicates the high value that ancient Mesopotamian civilization placed on literary preservation. The cuneiform writing system used to record the Epic of Gilgamesh was one of humanity's earliest writing technologies, originally developed for administrative record-keeping but gradually adapted to literary purposes. The transition from administrative to literary use of writing represents a crucial development in human cultural evolution, making possible the preservation and transmission of complex narratives across time and space in ways that purely oral traditions could not achieve. The technical challenges involved in using cuneiform for literary composition influenced the development of poetic techniques that remained characteristic of Mesopotamian literature throughout its history. The wedge-shaped marks that give cuneiform its name were well suited to certain kinds of rhythmic and formulaic composition, while the syllabic nature of the script encouraged wordplay and etymological speculation that enriched the semantic density of literary texts. The process of learning to read and write cuneiform required years of specialized training, making literacy a rare and valuable skill that was concentrated among professional scribes and educated elites. This meant that the Epic of Gilgamesh was initially accessible only to a small minority of the population, but it also meant that the people who could read it were likely to be sophisticated interpreters capable of appreciating its literary and philosophical complexities. The multilingual character of ancient Mesopotamian civilization meant that the Epic of Gilgamesh was translated and adapted into several different languages during its ancient transmission. Hittite, Hurrian, and Elamite versions have been discovered, indicating that the epic transcended ethnic and linguistic boundaries and served as a kind of international literature that could communicate across cultural differences. These translations were not merely mechanical conversions from one language to another, but involved cultural adaptation that made the story relevant to different audiences while preserving its essential themes and narrative structure. The Hittite version, for example, emphasizes different aspects of the story than the Babylonian version, reflecting the values and concerns of Hittite society, while maintaining the basic narrative framework that made the epic recognizable across cultures. The discovery and decipherment of these various versions has been one of the great achievements of modern archaeological and linguistic scholarship, requiring the combined efforts of specialists in multiple ancient languages and writing systems. The comparative study of different versions has illuminated not only the development of the epic itself, but also the processes by which literary works are transmitted and transformed as they move across cultural boundaries. The loss of the Epic of Gilgamesh to human knowledge for over 2 millennia represents one of history's great cultural tragedies, but also demonstrates the fragility of textual transmission and the importance of multiple preservation strategies. The epic survived only because it was preserved on clay tablets that could endure burial in the ground, unlike texts written on papyrus, parchment, or other perishable materials that would have disintegrated completely. The rediscovery of the epic in the 19th century was made possible by the development of archaeological techniques that allowed systematic excavation of ancient sites, combined with the intellectual breakthroughs that made cuneiform decipherment possible. The process of decipherment was itself a remarkable intellectual achievement, requiring scholars to work backwards from trilingual inscriptions and gradually build up knowledge of ancient languages that had been dead for centuries. George Smith's initial discovery and translation of the Flood Tablet in 1872 represents a dramatic moment in the history of scholarship, when a single individual's patient work suddenly opened up vast new territories of human knowledge. Smith's discovery was remarkable not only for its intrinsic importance, but also for the way it captured public imagination and demonstrated the relevance of ancient literature to contemporary audiences. The subsequent search for additional tablets of the epic involved archaeological expeditions throughout the Middle East, as museums and scholars competed to recover more pieces of the puzzle. This competitive atmosphere led to important discoveries, but also to the dispersion of tablets across multiple collections, making comprehensive study of the epic more difficult and highlighting ongoing issues about cultural property and archaeological ethics. The work of translation and interpretation that followed Smith's initial discovery has continued for over 150 years, as each generation of scholars has brought new insights and methodologies to bear on the ancient text. The history of Gilgamesh scholarship provides a fascinating case study in how academic disciplines develop and how our understanding of ancient texts evolves through the accumulation of knowledge and the refinement of interpretive techniques. The early translations of the epic, produced in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, reflected the scholarly methods and cultural assumptions of their time. These translations tended to emphasize the epic's connections to biblical literature and its role in illuminating ancient history, while paying less attention to its literary artistry and psychological sophistication. Later translations, produced as literary and archaeological scholarship became more sophisticated, revealed dimensions of the epic that earlier generations of scholars had missed or undervalued. The recognition of the epic's literary merit and its relevance to modern concerns led to translations that attempted to capture not only the meaning of the ancient text, but also its aesthetic and emotional impact. The ongoing work of translation continues today as new tablets are discovered and new methodologies are developed for understanding ancient literature. Computer analysis, comparative linguistics, and interdisciplinary collaboration have opened up new possibilities for interpreting the epic, while also raising new questions about the nature of translation and the challenges of making ancient texts accessible to contemporary readers. The Epic of Gilgamesh poses particular challenges for translators because of the gaps in the text, the ambiguities in ancient languages, and the cultural distance between ancient Mesopotamian and modern contexts. Translators must make countless decisions about how to render unclear passages, how to handle cultural references that have no modern equivalents, and how to balance fidelity to the ancient text with accessibility to modern readers. The various modern translations of the epic differ significantly in their approaches to these challenges, resulting in versions that sometimes seem to be telling quite different stories, despite their common source. Some translations attempt to preserve the formal characteristics of ancient poetry, while others prioritize narrative clarity and contemporary relevance. Some translators try to maintain scholarly accuracy at the expense of readability, while others sacrifice precision for literary effect. These translation choices are not merely technical issues but reflect deeper questions about the purpose of translation and the relationship between ancient and modern literature. Should translations attempt to transport modern readers back to the ancient world, or should they bring ancient texts forward into contemporary contexts? How much interpretation and explanation should translators provide, and how much should they leave to readers' imagination and investigation? The reception of the Epic of Gilgamesh in modern literature and culture has been profoundly influenced by the particular translations that have been most widely available and influential. The impact of different translation choices can be seen in the various ways that modern authors and artists have interpreted and adapted the epic, creating works that sometimes emphasize different aspects of the story, depending on which translation served as their source. The influence of the Epic of Gilgamesh on modern literature extends far beyond direct adaptations and references, to include subtler influences on narrative technique, character development, and thematic exploration. The epic's innovative use of parallel episodes, its circular narrative structure, its integration of mythological and psychological elements, and its sophisticated treatment of mortality and friendship have all influenced later literary development in ways that are not always immediately apparent. The psychological realism that makes the Epic of Gilgamesh so compelling to modern readers represents a significant innovation in ancient literature that would not be matched in complexity and sophistication until much later developments in world literature. The epic's portrayal of grief, its exploration of the psychology of friendship, and its treatment of the midlife crisis that drives Gilgamesh's quest for immortality all demonstrate understanding of human emotional development that anticipates modern psychological insights. The environmental themes in the epic have gained new relevance in contemporary discussions about climate change, deforestation, and the relationship between human civilization and natural ecosystems. The destruction of the cedar forest and the killing of its guardian Humbaba can be read as an early example of the environmental costs of human development, while Enkidu's transformation from wild man to civilized human represents the larger human journey from integration with nature to domination over it. The political themes in the epic speak to contemporary concerns about leadership, power, and the responsibilities of those who govern others. Gilgamesh's initial portrayal as a tyrant who abuses his power and oppresses his subjects provides a template for understanding political corruption, while his ultimate development into a wise and responsible ruler offers models for political education and reform. The epic's treatment of war and violence raises questions that remain relevant in contemporary discussions about the ethics of conflict and the proper limits of military action. The hero's adventures in the cedar forest and their confrontation with the Bull of Heaven involve violence that is simultaneously celebrated as heroic achievement and questioned as morally problematic, creating moral complexity that resists simple resolution. The religious and spiritual dimensions of the epic make it valuable for readers interested in exploring questions of ultimate meaning without being confined to any particular theological tradition. The epic's portrayal of divine characters as flawed and limited beings offers alternatives to both traditional theism and modern secularism, suggesting more nuanced understandings of the relationship between human and transcendent reality. The epic's treatment of death and immortality provides resources for contemporary discussions about medical technology, life extension, and end-of-life care. Gilgamesh's obsession with achieving immortality and his ultimate acceptance of mortality as a condition of meaningful human life offers perspectives on these issues that are both ancient and remarkably contemporary, suggesting that fundamental questions about life and death are perennial human concerns that each generation must address in its own context. The friendship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu offers models for understanding intimate relationships that transcend conventional social categories. Their bond represents a form of human connection that is deeper than ordinary friendship but different from romantic love, suggesting possibilities for human relationship that are not adequately captured by contemporary relationship categories, but that remain emotionally and psychologically compelling. The epic's structure as a journey narrative has provided a template for understanding personal development and spiritual growth that has influenced everything from psychotherapy to adventure literature. The pattern of departure from familiar surroundings, encounter with challenges and helpers, transformation through ordeal, and return with new wisdom has become a standard framework for stories about human development and discovery. The archaeological discoveries that have been made in connection with the Epic of Gilgamesh have enhanced our understanding both of the epic itself and of the civilization that produced it. Excavations at Uruk, the city that Gilgamesh supposedly ruled, have revealed a complex urban civilization that matches many details of the epic's descriptions, while also providing historical context for understanding the challenges that ancient urban rulers would have faced. The historical Gilgamesh, if he existed, would have lived during the early dynastic period of Mesopotamian history, around 2700 BCE, when the first true cities were developing in southern Mesopotamia. The Sumerian king list identifies Gilgamesh as the fifth king of Uruk's first dynasty, ruling for 126 years and accomplishing great building projects that enhanced his city's power and prestige. Contemporary administrative records from Uruk and other Mesopotamian cities provide insights into the practical challenges of early urban governance that help explain why Gilgamesh became such a powerful figure in later literary tradition. The development of agriculture, the management of irrigation systems, the organization of craft production, the regulation of trade, and the maintenance of military forces all required administrative and leadership skills that had never been needed in smaller, simpler societies. The transformation of historical memory into legendary narrative represents a common pattern in human culture, as communities preserve and transmit knowledge about their past through stories that emphasize meaning rather than factual accuracy. The historical Gilgamesh may have been an effective administrator and military leader, but the legendary Gilgamesh became a vehicle for exploring universal human concerns about power, friendship, mortality, and the search for meaning. The process by which historical figures become legendary characters involves both preservation and transformation, as each generation retells the stories in ways that address contemporary concerns while maintaining connections to the past. The Epic of Gilgamesh represents the culmination of this process, transforming whatever historical reality lay behind the original stories into a work of art that transcends its specific historical origins to address universal human experience. The oral tradition that preceded and probably continued alongside the written versions of the epic would have involved live performance contexts that influenced both the content and the form of the stories. Epic poetry in ancient Mesopotamia was probably performed at religious festivals, royal celebrations, and other public occasions where professional poets would adapt their material to specific audiences and circumstances. The techniques of oral composition and performance that shaped the early development of the epic can still be detected in the written versions, particularly in the use of repetition, formulaic expressions, and episodic structure that characterize oral poetry throughout the world. The epic's use of parallel episodes and recurring themes reflects the needs of oral poets who had to create coherent narratives without the aid of written notes or scripts. The transition from oral to written composition represents a crucial development in the history of literature, making possible new kinds of narrative complexity and thematic development, while also creating new challenges for poets who had to learn to compose for readers rather than listeners. The Epic of Gilgamesh represents one of humanity's earliest experiments in written literary composition, developing techniques that would influence literary development throughout the ancient world. The social and cultural functions of the epic within ancient Mesopotamian society extended beyond simple entertainment to include education, religious instruction, and the transmission of cultural values. The epic served as a kind of textbook for understanding proper kingship, appropriate friendship, and the right relationship between humans and gods, while also providing models for courage, loyalty, and wisdom. The epic's use in educational contexts is evident from the number of school tablets that contain excerpts from the story, suggesting that students learn to read and write by copying passages from this and other literary works. The choice of the Epic of Gilgamesh as educational material indicates that ancient Mesopotamian educators valued it not only for its literary merit, but also for the moral and cultural instruction it provided. The religious significance of the epic is evident from its preservation in temple libraries and its connections to various religious festivals and ceremonies. The flood narrative in particular seems to have had ritual significance, as it appears in other contexts that suggest its use in ceremonies related to agricultural cycles and divine judgment. The epic's influence on the development of later Middle Eastern literature can be traced through various biblical and post-biblical texts that show clear knowledge of Gilgamesh traditions. The flood narrative in Genesis obviously derives from Mesopotamian sources, while other biblical texts show less obvious but still significant influences from the epic tradition. The Book of Ecclesiastes in the Hebrew Bible shows particularly strong thematic connections to the Epic of Gilgamesh, especially in its treatment of mortality, the vanity of human ambitions, and the importance of finding joy in simple pleasures. The famous passage about a time for everything under heaven echoes themes that are central to the Gilgamesh tradition, while the book's overall pessimism about human achievement reflects concerns that are also prominent in the ancient epic. The influence of Mesopotamian literature on early Jewish culture was facilitated by the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE, when many educated Jews were forced to live in Mesopotamia and would have had direct exposure to the literary traditions preserved in Babylonian schools and libraries. The cultural exchange that occurred during this period influenced the development of both Jewish and Mesopotamian literature in ways that can still be detected in surviving texts. The Epic of Gilgamesh also influenced the development of Greek literature, though the mechanisms of transmission are less clear than in the case of Jewish literature. The themes and narrative patterns that characterize the epic can be found in various Greek works, from the Homeric epics to later philosophical and dramatic texts, suggesting either direct influence or the independent development of similar responses to universal human concerns. The psychological insights that make the Epic of Gilgamesh so compelling to modern readers reflect the sophistication of ancient Mesopotamian understanding of human nature and emotional development. The epic's portrayal of grief, trauma, and healing demonstrates awareness of psychological processes that would not be systematically studied until the development of modern psychology. Yet the ancient insights remain convincing and therapeutically valuable. The epic's treatment of the relationship between civilization and wilderness, embodied in Enkidu's transformation from wild man to civilized human, addresses questions about human nature and social development that continue to be debated by anthropologists, sociologists, and philosophers. The epic suggests both the benefits and the costs of civilized life, acknowledging that the development of culture and technology involves losses as well as gains. The environmental consciousness that appears in various episodes of the epic anticipates contemporary concerns about sustainability and the proper relationship between human society and natural ecosystems. The destruction of the cedar forest serves as a cautionary tale about the environmental costs of human development, while the epic's overall treatment of natural forces suggests respect for the power and importance of non-human nature. The epic's treatment of gender roles and relationships reflects the social assumptions of ancient Mesopotamian culture, but also contains elements that challenge conventional expectations and suggest more complex understandings of masculine and feminine identity. The character of Shamat, who transforms Enkidu from wild man to civilized human, represents feminine wisdom and sexual power, while the friendship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu explores masculine intimacy in ways that transcend simple stereotypes. The religious dimensions of the epic address fundamental questions about divine justice, human suffering, and the meaning of existence that remain central to theological and philosophical inquiry. The epic's portrayal of gods as powerful but not omniscient or omnipotent beings offers alternatives to later theological developments, while suggesting that divine human relationships are characterized by complexity and ambiguity, rather than simple hierarchy or clear moral guidance. As we drift deeper into the ancient rhythms of this foundational story, let the accumulated wisdom of 4,000 years of human reflection on mortality, friendship, and the search for meaning provide a foundation for rest and contemplation. The Epic of Gilgamesh moves with the patience of geological time, its themes unfolding across millennia like the gradual formation of great rivers, each generation of readers adding new tributaries of understanding to the vast delta of human interpretation. The friendship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu endures as one of literature's most powerful representations of human connection, because it embodies both the joy and the sorrow that characterize all deep relationships. Their bond represents the universal human need for companionship and understanding, while their separation through death confronts the reality that all relationships are temporary and that love inevitably involves loss. The circular journey of the epic, returning Gilgamesh to the walls of Uruk with deeper understanding of their meaning and value, suggests that wisdom comes not through escape from the human condition, but through fuller acceptance of its constraints and possibilities. The walls that seemed limiting at the beginning of the story become symbols of human achievement and community by the end, seen through eyes educated by experience and suffering. In the approaching silence of sleep, let the ancient voices that first told this story continue their patient conversation about what it means to be human in a world that offers both beauty and suffering, companionship and solitude, achievement and loss. The Epic of Gilgamesh speaks across the centuries with undiminished power because it addresses concerns that are as immediate today as they were when the first cities rose from the marshes of ancient Mesopotamia. The questions that drove Gilgamesh on his quest for understanding remain our questions. How should we face mortality? What gives life meaning in the face of inevitable death? How do we love fully while knowing that loss is certain? What responsibilities do we have to one another and to the communities that sustain us? How do we find purpose in achievements that are temporary and relationships that are finite? The epic offers no easy answers to these questions, but it provides something more valuable: the companionship of others who have struggled with the same concerns and the assurance that these struggles are not signs of personal failure, but are inherent aspects of the human condition that connect us to all those who have lived before us and all those who will come after. In dreams, we join Gilgamesh and Enkidu on their eternal journey toward understanding, discovering that the most important adventures are not external conquests but internal transformations, not the achievement of immortality but the acceptance of mortality as the condition that makes love, friendship, and meaning possible. Their story becomes our story, their questions become our questions, their hard-won wisdom becomes part of the inheritance that each generation receives from those who have gone before. The great library of Ashurbanipal may have crumbled into dust, but the conversations it housed continue in every human heart that wonders about its place in the vast mystery of existence. The clay tablets may have returned to earth, but the questions they preserved remain as fresh and urgent as the day they were first inscribed by hands, guided by the same concerns that guide our own searching and questioning. In the brief time allotted to each conscious being fortunate enough to participate in the ongoing human conversation about meaning, purpose, and the magnificent, challenging gift of temporary existence in an endlessly fascinating and ultimately mysterious cosmos. The individual tablets that preserve the Epic of Gilgamesh tell their own stories about the dedication and skill of the ancient scribes who created them. Tablet 11, which contains the flood narrative and was the first portion of the epic to be discovered and translated by George Smith, bears the marks of careful craftsmanship that reflect the reverence with which ancient scribes approached their task of preserving important literature for future generations. The physical characteristics of this tablet reveal the sophisticated techniques that Mesopotamian scribes had developed for creating durable written records. The clay was carefully prepared, kneaded to remove air bubbles and achieve uniform consistency, then shaped into a rectangular form that provided optimal surface area for text while remaining manageable for storage and handling. The scribe who created this tablet worked with precision and artistry, forming each cuneiform sign with attention to both legibility and aesthetic appeal. The layout of text on the tablet reflects centuries of accumulated wisdom about how to organize written information for maximum clarity and accessibility. The lines of text are evenly spaced and carefully aligned, with margins that frame the writing and create visual balance. The scribe used different sizes of cuneiform signs to create hierarchical emphasis, making the structure of the narrative clear to readers even before they began deciphering individual words. The colophon at the end of Tablet 11 identifies the scribe responsible for this copy and provides information about when and where it was created. These colophons, found on many ancient Mesopotamian tablets, represent one of humanity's earliest systems for maintaining bibliographic information and ensuring proper attribution of written works. They also provide valuable historical information about the transmission of literary texts and the institutional context in which copying took place. The survival of Tablet 11 through more than 2.5 millennia of burial in the ruins of Nineveh required not only the durability of the clay medium, but also fortunate circumstances that protected it from the various destructive forces that eliminated so many other ancient texts. The tablet was preserved in the collapsed remains of Ashurbanipal's library, where fallen roof timbers and accumulated debris created a protective environment that shielded it from weathering and human disturbance. The discovery of this tablet by Hormuzd Rassam's excavation team in the 1850s represents a convergence of archaeological technique, historical circumstance, and scholarly preparation that made possible one of the most dramatic moments in the history of literary discovery. Rassam, working under the auspices of the British Museum, was conducting systematic excavations at Nineveh, using methods that were advanced for their time, carefully recording the locations and contexts of discoveries while preserving fragile materials for later study. The institutional support that made Rassam's work possible reflects the growing recognition in 19th century Europe that ancient texts could provide valuable insights into human history and culture. The British Museum's investment in Mesopotamian archaeology was motivated partly by competition with French and German institutions, but also by genuine scholarly interest in recovering knowledge that had been lost for millennia. The process of cataloguing and initial conservation that brought Tablet 11 to George Smith's attention demonstrates the systematic approaches that museums were developing for managing large collections of archaeological materials. Smith's role as a cataloguer required not only technical skill in reading cuneiform, but also broad knowledge of ancient Mesopotamian literature that allowed him to recognize the significance of what he was reading. Smith's emotional reaction to his discovery, famously including his jumping up and rushing about the room in excitement, reflects the profound impact that the recovery of ancient literature can have on those who first encounter it. His recognition that he was reading humanity's oldest known flood narrative, predating the biblical account by more than a millennium, represented a watershed moment in the understanding of ancient literature and religious development. The subsequent expeditions that Smith undertook to search for additional tablets of the epic were funded by popular subscriptions raised through newspaper campaigns, demonstrating the public interest that his discovery had generated. The London Daily Telegraph's sponsorship of Smith's 1872 expedition to Nineveh represents one of the earliest examples of media-funded archaeological research, establishing a pattern of popular support for scholarly discovery that continues today. Smith's tragic death in Syria in 1876 while returning from his second expedition to search for Gilgamesh tablets adds a poignant dimension to the story of the epic's rediscovery. His dedication to recovering the complete text of the ancient epic cost him his life, but his work established the foundation for all subsequent study of Mesopotamian literature and made possible the full appreciation of the epic's literary and cultural significance. The tablets that Smith and subsequent scholars recovered from various Mesopotamian sites provide a complex picture of how the Epic of Gilgamesh was transmitted and preserved across many centuries. The different versions found at different sites suggest that the epic existed in multiple forms simultaneously, with local scribal traditions maintaining their own preferred texts, while also being influenced by versions from other regions. The Old Babylonian tablets found at Sippar, dating to around 1800 BCE, preserve episodes that are not found in the later standard version, suggesting that the epic tradition was richer and more varied than the canonical version alone would suggest. These tablets provide insights into earlier stages of the epic's development, and reveal how the story evolved as it was transmitted from Sumerian into Akkadian and adapted to changing cultural circumstances. The Middle Babylonian fragments found at various sites throughout Mesopotamia show evidence of continued textual innovation during the 2nd millennium BCE, with scribes adding new episodes, revising existing materials, and experimenting with different approaches to characterization and narrative structure. This period of active development suggests that the Epic of Gilgamesh was not simply a static text being copied mechanically, but was a living literary tradition that continued to grow and change. The scribal schools that produced these various versions of the epic were sophisticated educational institutions that combined practical training in reading and writing with advanced instruction in literature, theology, and scholarly methods. Students in these schools learned to read and write by copying classical texts, including the Epic of Gilgamesh, but they were also taught to think critically about the materials they were copying and to make informed judgments about textual variants and editorial choices. The curriculum of these scribal schools, reconstructed from thousands of school tablets found at archaeological sites throughout Mesopotamia, reveals the central role that literature played in ancient education. The Epic of Gilgamesh was not simply entertainment, but was considered an essential part of the cultural knowledge that educated people were expected to possess. Students who memorized portions of the epic were learning not only literary techniques but also moral philosophy, religious doctrine, and cultural values. The teachers in these scribal schools were not merely instructors in technical skills, but were scholars and intellectuals who contributed to the ongoing development of Mesopotamian literary tradition. Their annotations, commentaries, and variant readings, preserved on school tablets and library copies, provide insights into how ancient readers interpreted and understood the epic, while also documenting the scholarly methods that ancient educators used to transmit cultural knowledge. The libraries that preserved the Epic of Gilgamesh were not simply storage facilities, but were active centres of learning and scholarship where texts were studied, compared, and interpreted by successive generations of scholars. The library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, which contained the most complete collection of Gilgamesh tablets, was organised according to sophisticated cataloguing systems that allowed scholars to locate and compare different versions of texts efficiently. The international character of these ancient libraries is evident from the multilingual collections they contained, including not only Akkadian texts, but also works in Sumerian, Hittite, Hurrian, and other ancient languages. The presence of multiple versions of the Epic of Gilgamesh in different languages suggests that ancient scholars were engaged in comparative literary study and were interested in understanding how stories changed as they were transmitted across cultural boundaries. The scholarly apparatus that ancient libraries developed for managing complex textual traditions included standardized formats for citations, systematic approaches to variant readings, and sophisticated methods for creating definitive editions of important works. The standard version of the Epic of Gilgamesh represents the culmination of this scholarly activity, bringing together materials from diverse sources and shaping them into a unified work that could serve as an authoritative text for future generations. The destruction of these ancient libraries, whether through military conquest, natural disaster, or simple neglect, represents one of humanity's greatest cultural losses. The burning of the library of Ashurbanipal during the fall of Nineveh in 612 BCE eliminated not only the building and its contents, but also the scholarly community that had maintained and developed the textual traditions preserved there. The consequences of this destruction extended far beyond the immediate loss of individual texts to include the disruption of the cultural and educational systems that had made the preservation and transmission of literature possible. Without the institutional support of libraries and schools, even texts that survived in scattered copies gradually disappeared from active use and eventually from human knowledge entirely. The The Epic of Gilgamesh survived this catastrophe only because copies existed in multiple locations, and because the clay tablet medium proved remarkably durable under burial conditions. The tablets that preserved the epic lay buried and forgotten for over 2 millennia, protected by the very destruction that had eliminated the cultural contexts in which they had originally been meaningful and accessible. The rediscovery of these buried tablets in the 19th century required not only archaeological techniques for locating and recovering ancient sites, but also scholarly methods for deciphering and interpreting texts written in languages that had been dead for centuries. The development of cuneiform studies as an academic discipline involved the collaborative efforts of scholars from many countries working to unlock the secrets of ancient Mesopotamian civilization. The decipherment of cuneiform script was itself a monumental intellectual achievement that required brilliant scholarship, patient investigation, and fortunate discoveries that provided the keys to understanding ancient writing systems. The trilingual inscriptions found at Behistun and other sites provided the Rosetta Stone equivalents that made cuneiform decipherment possible, but the process still required decades of careful work by many scholars. The establishment of cuneiform as a readable ancient script opened up vast new territories of human knowledge, making accessible thousands of years of history, literature, and scholarship that had been completely unknown to the modern world. The Epic of Gilgamesh was one of the most spectacular discoveries that emerged from this process, but it was accompanied by equally significant finds in law, science, religion, and other domains of human knowledge. The institutional development that accompanied cuneiform studies created new forms of international scholarly collaboration that transcended national boundaries and political rivalries. Museums, universities, and learned societies throughout Europe and America shared resources, expertise, and discoveries in the common effort to understand ancient Mesopotamian civilization and make its achievements accessible to contemporary audiences. The popular impact of discoveries like the Epic of Gilgamesh extended far beyond academic circles to influence literature, religion, and general cultural understanding. The recognition that sophisticated civilizations had existed thousands of years before the classical Greek and Roman periods challenged existing ideas about human development and cultural progress, while also raising new questions about the relationship between ancient and modern achievements. The Epic of Gilgamesh played a particularly important role in these broader cultural conversations because of its obvious literary merits and its relevance to contemporary concerns. Unlike many ancient texts that seemed alien or obsolete to modern readers, the epic spoke directly to universal human experiences and emotions that transcended historical and cultural boundaries. The influence of the epic on modern literature began almost immediately after its rediscovery and translation, as writers and intellectuals recognized its power and relevance to contemporary concerns. Early adaptations and references appeared in works by authors who were excited by the discovery of humanity's oldest literature and eager to explore its themes and techniques. The psychological realism that makes the Epic of Gilgamesh so compelling to modern readers was not immediately recognized by 19th century scholars who were more interested in its historical and religious significance than in its literary artistry. The appreciation of the epic as sophisticated literature, rather than simply ancient document, required the development of new critical approaches that could recognize and analyze the psychological complexity of ancient texts. The feminist scholarship that emerged in the 20th century brought new perspectives to the interpretation of the Epic of Gilgamesh, particularly regarding the roles of female characters and the treatment of gender relationships. The character of Shamat, who transforms Enkidu from wild man to civilized human, has been reinterpreted as representing feminine wisdom and sexual power rather than simply temptation or corruption. The environmental consciousness that has developed in recent decades has led to new readings of the epic that emphasize its treatment of the relationship between human civilization and natural ecosystems. The destruction of the cedar forest and the killing of its guardian Humbaba are now often interpreted as early examples of environmental destruction and the loss of natural balance through human intervention. The post-colonial perspectives that have influenced literary studies in recent decades have raised new questions about the Western appropriation and interpretation of ancient Middle Eastern texts like the Epic of Gilgamesh. These perspectives have highlighted the need for more culturally sensitive approaches to ancient literature and greater attention to contemporary Middle Eastern scholarly voices in the interpretation of their own cultural heritage. The digital humanities projects that are making ancient texts more accessible through online databases and multimedia presentations represent new possibilities for democratic access to cultural heritage that was previously available only to specialists. The Epic of Gilgamesh has been among the ancient texts that have benefited most from these technological developments, with multiple digital editions, translations, and interpretive resources now available to general audiences. The continuing archaeological discoveries that add new fragments to our knowledge of the Epic of Gilgamesh demonstrate that the process of textual recovery is far from complete. Recent finds have included tablets that fill gaps in the existing text, versions that preserve variant readings, and fragments that suggest the existence of episodes not previously known to modern scholarship. The techniques that archaeologists and philologists have developed for working with fragmentary and damaged texts have improved dramatically since George Smith's pioneering work in the 19th century. Computer imaging, statistical analysis, and collaborative databases have made it possible to recover text from tablets that were previously considered illegible and to reconstruct coherent narratives from scattered fragments. The international cooperation that characterizes modern Gilgamesh scholarship has created resources and opportunities that far exceed what any individual scholar or institution could achieve independently. The sharing of photographs, transcriptions, translations, and interpretations through digital networks has made possible forms of collaborative research that are transforming our understanding of ancient literature. The interdisciplinary approaches that contemporary scholars bring to the study of the Epic of Gilgamesh have revealed dimensions of the text that were not apparent to earlier generations of readers. Archaeological evidence, anthropological insights, psychological theories, and literary criticism have all contributed to richer and more nuanced interpretations of the ancient epic. The comparative studies that examine the Epic of Gilgamesh in relation to other ancient and modern literatures have illuminated both its uniqueness and its participation in broader patterns of human storytelling. The epic's influence on subsequent literature can be traced through direct references and adaptations, but also through subtler influences on narrative technique, character development, and thematic exploration. The translation studies that examine how the Epic of Gilgamesh has been rendered into modern languages have revealed the challenges and opportunities involved in making ancient literature accessible to contemporary audiences. Each translation involves countless decisions about how to balance fidelity to ancient meanings with accessibility to modern readers, and these decisions profoundly influence how the epic is understood and valued. The pedagogical applications of the Epic of Gilgamesh in contemporary education have made it one of the most widely taught ancient texts, introduced to students at levels ranging from high school through graduate study. The epic's accessibility, relevance, and literary merit make it an ideal introduction to ancient literature, while also providing opportunities for sophisticated analysis and interpretation. The therapeutic applications of the Epic of Gilgamesh in counseling and healing contexts have drawn on the psychological insights embedded in the ancient narrative, particularly its treatment of grief, trauma, and the search for meaning in the face of loss. The epic's portrayal of Gilgamesh's journey from despair to acceptance has provided models for understanding and facilitating personal growth and healing. The artistic adaptations of the Epic of Gilgamesh in visual arts, music, theatre, and film have explored the creative possibilities inherent in the ancient narrative, while also making it accessible to audiences who might not otherwise encounter ancient literature. These adaptations have ranged from faithful recreations of the ancient story to loose inspirations that use Gilgamesh themes to explore contemporary concerns. The scholarly editions of the Epic of Gilgamesh that have been produced for academic audiences represent some of the finest achievements of modern philological scholarship, combining linguistic expertise, historical knowledge, and literary sensitivity to create resources that make the ancient text accessible to specialists while also preserving the scholarly apparatus necessary for continued research and interpretation. The popular editions and adaptations that have brought the Epic of Gilgamesh to general audiences have played a crucial role in establishing its position as one of the world's great literary works. These versions, while necessarily simplified compared to scholarly editions, have made it possible for millions of readers to encounter the epic and appreciate its enduring relevance to human experience. The cultural impact of the Epic of Gilgamesh extends beyond its direct influence on literature and scholarship to include its role in shaping contemporary understanding of ancient civilizations and human cultural development. The epic has become a symbol of humanity's earliest literary achievements and a reminder of the sophistication and relevance of ancient wisdom. The preservation challenges that face the Epic of Gilgamesh and other ancient texts in the contemporary world include both physical threats to the tablets themselves and institutional threats to the scholarly infrastructure that makes their study possible. Climate change, political instability, and economic pressures all pose risks to the archaeological sites and museum collections where these irreplaceable cultural resources are preserved. The digital preservation efforts that are creating permanent electronic records of ancient texts represent crucial insurance against the loss of these materials while also making them more accessible to scholars and general audiences. The Epic of Gilgamesh has been among the ancient texts that have received priority attention in these preservation efforts because of its cultural significance and scholarly importance. The ethical questions raised by the study and preservation of ancient texts like the Epic of Gilgamesh include issues of cultural ownership, scholarly access, and the responsibilities of institutions that hold these materials in trust for humanity. The tablets that preserve the epic are now scattered among museums and collections throughout the world, raising questions about how best to ensure their preservation and accessibility. The future prospects for Gilgamesh studies include both opportunities created by new technologies and methodologies and challenges posed by changing institutional and political circumstances. The development of artificial intelligence applications for textual analysis, the growth of international collaborative networks, and the increasing sophistication of digital humanities approaches all suggest possibilities for new discoveries and insights. The continuing relevance of the Epic of Gilgamesh to contemporary audiences suggests that its study will remain vital and important for future generations of scholars and readers. The epic's treatment of universal human concerns ensures that each new generation will find fresh meanings and applications in the ancient narrative, while its historical significance guarantees its continued importance for understanding human cultural development. The educational value of the Epic of Gilgamesh as an introduction to ancient literature and culture has been demonstrated through decades of successful classroom use at all levels of instruction. The epic's combination of accessibility and sophistication makes it an ideal text for helping students develop skills in literary analysis while also providing historical and cultural knowledge that enriches their understanding of human civilization. The research potential that remains in Gilgamesh studies suggests that our understanding of the epic and its cultural context will continue to deepen and develop as new materials are discovered and new methodologies are applied. The recent discoveries of new tablets and fragments indicate that significant additions to our knowledge are still possible, while the development of new analytical techniques suggests that fresh insights can be gained even from familiar materials. As we settle more deeply into the rhythm of this ancient narrative that has survived 4 millennia of human history, let the accumulated wisdom of generations of storytellers, scribes, scholars, and readers provide a foundation for reflection and rest. The Epic of Gilgamesh moves with the measured pace of civilizations rising and transforming, its themes unfolding across centuries like the gradual formation of great mountains, each generation adding new layers of understanding to the enduring bedrock of human story. The tablets that preserve this epic lie in climate-controlled storage rooms in museums around the world, their cuneiform inscriptions as sharp and clear as the day they were made, waiting patiently for scholars and readers who will continue the conversation that began when the first Sumerian poets shaped these stories from the clay of ancient riverbeds. The questions they explored about friendship, mortality, power, and the search for meaning remain as urgent today as when Uruk was the greatest city in the world. The circular journey of scholarship that brought the Epic of Gilgamesh back into human consciousness mirrors the circular journey of the epic itself, returning us to familiar starting points with eyes educated by experience and understanding deepened by time. We have travelled from the buried tablets of ancient Nineveh through the patient work of generations of scholars to arrive at new appreciation for the sophistication and relevance of ancient wisdom. In the approaching quiet of sleep, let these ancient rhythms of questioning and seeking provide currents deeper than individual consciousness, more reliable than personal memory, more enduring than any single lifetime. The Epic of Gilgamesh offers not escape from human complexity, but fuller participation in the ongoing human project of creating meaning from mystery, finding purpose in temporary existence, and discovering beauty in the midst of inevitable change. The friendship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu speaks across 40 centuries because it embodies truths about human connection that transcend historical circumstances and cultural differences. Their bond represents the universal human need for companionship and understanding, while their separation through death confronts the reality that all love involves vulnerability and all relationships are shadowed by loss. Let their eternal conversation carry your awareness into the deeper mysteries that sleep makes accessible, where the boundaries between ancient and modern, individual and universal, mortal and enduring dissolve into the vast, patient breathing of time itself. In dreams, we join the scribes in their ancient libraries, copying and preserving the stories that matter most, adding our own voices to the chorus that began when humans first discovered that words could capture experience and share it across the generations. The great library of Ashurbanipal may have burned, but the conversations it fostered continue in every reader who discovers that the oldest human stories speak with undiminished power to contemporary hearts and minds. The clay tablets may rest in museum cases, but the questions they preserve remain as immediate and pressing as when they were first pressed into soft clay by hands guided by the same curiosities and concerns that guide our own brief journey through the magnificent, challenging, and ultimately mysterious adventure of conscious existence, in a universe that seems designed to support both wonder and wisdom, both individual searching and collective discovery of meaning. The specific textual variants that appear in different versions of the Epic of Gilgamesh reveal the living, breathing nature of ancient literature and the ways in which each generation of scribes contributed to the ongoing development of the narrative. The Pennsylvania tablet, an old Babylonian fragment discovered at Nippur in the early 20th century, contains episodes and details that are absent from the standard version, suggesting that the epic tradition was far richer and more varied than the canonical text alone would indicate. This Pennsylvania tablet preserves a version of Enkidu's death that differs significantly from the standard version, with extended dialogue between Gilgamesh and his dying friend that explores their relationship with greater psychological depth and emotional intensity. The variant readings found in this tablet suggest that ancient scribes had considerable freedom to elaborate and modify the traditional narratives, treating them not as fixed texts to be copied mechanically, but as living traditions that could be enhanced through creative interpretation. The Hittite fragments of the Epic of Gilgamesh, discovered at the ancient capital of Hattusa in modern Turkey, represent the epic's adaptation into a completely different cultural and linguistic context. These fragments, dating to around 1400 BCE, show how the story was modified to address the concerns and values of Hittite society, while maintaining its essential narrative structure and thematic focus. The Hittite version places greater emphasis on the role of divine authority and royal responsibility, reflecting the more centralized and hierarchical nature of Hittite political organization compared to the city-state system that characterized Mesopotamian civilization. The characterization of Gilgamesh in the Hittite version emphasizes his duties as a king and his relationship with divine patrons, while maintaining the psychological complexity that makes the character compelling across cultural boundaries. The Hurrian fragments found at various sites in northern Mesopotamia and Syria provide evidence for yet another cultural adaptation of the Gilgamesh tradition, suggesting that the epic's themes and narrative patterns were sufficiently universal to transcend the specific cultural contexts in which they originated. The Hurrian version appears to have emphasized different aspects of the story, particularly the relationship between civilization and wilderness that is embodied in Enkidu's transformation. These multilingual adaptations of the Epic of Gilgamesh demonstrate the sophisticated literary culture that characterized the ancient Middle East, where stories and themes could move freely across linguistic and ethnic boundaries, while being adapted to local circumstances and values. The process of translation and cultural adaptation involved not merely linguistic conversion, but creative reinterpretation that made the stories relevant to new audiences while preserving their essential insights about human nature and experience. The survival of the Epic of Gilgamesh through the various political and cultural upheavals that characterized ancient Middle Eastern history required institutional support from educational and religious establishments that valued literary preservation. The scribal schools that maintained these traditions were not simply technical training centers, but were sophisticated intellectual institutions that combined practical instruction with advanced scholarship and cultural preservation. The curriculum of these schools, reconstructed from thousands of practice tablets found throughout Mesopotamia, reveals the central role that literature played in ancient education. Students learned to read and write by copying classical texts, including the Epic of Gilgamesh, but they were also expected to memorize large portions of the literature and to understand its cultural and religious significance. The educational use of the Epic of Gilgamesh extended beyond simple literacy training to include moral instruction, historical education, and religious indoctrination. The epic served as a textbook for understanding proper kingship, appropriate friendship, and the right relationship between humans and gods, while also providing examples of courage, loyalty, and wisdom that students were expected to emulate in their own lives. The religious dimensions of the epic made it particularly valuable for educational purposes in a culture where secular and sacred knowledge were not sharply distinguished. The epic's portrayal of divine characters, its treatment of religious themes, and its exploration of theological questions provided opportunities for religious instruction, while also entertaining students and maintaining their interest in the learning process. The memorization techniques that students used to master long portions of the epic involved sophisticated mnemonic strategies that took advantage of the repetitive and formulaic elements that characterize oral poetry. These techniques, developed over centuries of educational practice, made it possible for students to internalize vast amounts of literary material and to reproduce it accurately even without written prompts. The competitive elements that characterized ancient education, including contests between students and schools, provided additional motivation for mastering classical literature like the Epic of Gilgamesh. Students who could recite the epic accurately and interpret its meanings intelligently gained prestige and career advantages that justified the years of intensive study required to achieve such mastery. The social functions of the Epic of Gilgamesh within ancient Mesopotamian culture extended far beyond its role in formal education to include its use in religious ceremonies, political events, and social gatherings where literature served to create shared cultural identity and reinforce social values. The epic's themes of friendship, loyalty, and proper leadership made it particularly suitable for occasions that celebrated community bonds and social solidarity. The performance context in which the Epic of Gilgamesh was presented to public audiences would have influenced both its content and its interpretation, as skilled reciters adapted their presentations to specific circumstances and audiences. The epic's episodic structure and its use of parallel incidents made it well suited to partial performance, allowing reciters to select episodes that were particularly relevant to specific occasions or audiences. The musical accompaniment that probably accompanied public recitations of the epic would have enhanced its emotional impact, while also providing mnemonic support for performers who were reciting from memory. The rhythmic and formulaic elements that characterize the epic's poetry were designed to work effectively with musical accompaniment, creating multimedia presentations that engaged audiences on multiple sensory levels. The visual elements that may have accompanied performances of the epic, including costumes, props, and possibly even dramatic action, would have transformed the literary experience into theatrical presentation that brought the ancient stories to life for audiences. The archaeological discovery of artistic representations of Gilgamesh episodes suggests that the epic's visual dimension was important for ancient audiences and may have influenced how the stories were told and understood. The seasonal festivals during which the Epic of Gilgamesh was performed created ritualized contexts that enhanced the story's religious and cultural significance, while also providing regular opportunities for community participation in shared literary experience. These festivals created temporal rhythms that connected the epic's themes with the cyclical patterns of agricultural and religious life. The international character of ancient Middle Eastern culture meant that the Epic of Gilgamesh was known and appreciated by educated people throughout the region, creating a kind of shared literary culture that transcended political and ethnic boundaries. Diplomatic correspondence and international treaties from various periods contain references to the epic that suggest its widespread familiarity among political and intellectual elites. The influence of the Epic of Gilgamesh on the development of later Middle Eastern literature can be traced through various biblical and post-biblical texts that show clear knowledge of the Mesopotamian tradition. The flood narrative in Genesis obviously derives from sources like the Gilgamesh flood story, but the influences extend beyond specific episodes to include narrative techniques, character types, and thematic approaches. The Book of Job in the Hebrew Bible shows particularly strong thematic connections to the Epic of Gilgamesh, especially in its treatment of innocent suffering, divine justice, and the search for meaning in the face of inexplicable loss. The dialogue structure that characterizes much of Job may have been influenced by the conversational elements that are prominent in the Epic of Gilgamesh, while both works explore similar questions about the relationship between human virtue and divine reward. The wisdom literature traditions that developed throughout the ancient Middle East show clear influences from the Epic of Gilgamesh, particularly in their treatment of mortality, the proper use of power, and the importance of friendship and loyalty in human relationships. The Mesopotamian understanding of wisdom as something gained through experience and suffering, rather than simply through instruction, appears in various forms throughout later wisdom traditions. The apocalyptic literature that emerged in later Jewish and Christian traditions incorporates elements from the Mesopotamian flood tradition that are preserved in the Epic of Gilgamesh, but transforms them to serve different theological and political purposes. The vision of cosmic destruction and renewal that characterizes apocalyptic texts draws on much older traditions of divine judgment and universal catastrophe that are represented in the epic's flood narrative. The influence of the Epic of Gilgamesh on early Christian literature extends beyond specific textual borrowings to include broader patterns of thinking about heroism, sacrifice, and the relationship between divine and human nature. The epic's portrayal of a hero who is partly divine and partly human may have influenced early Christian thinking about the incarnation, while its treatment of death and resurrection themes appears in various transformed ways in Christian literature. The Islamic traditions that developed in the Middle East during the early medieval period preserved knowledge of pre-Islamic literary traditions, including elements that can be traced back to the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Quranic flood narrative and various Islamic legends about ancient kings and heroes show influences that suggest continued familiarity with the Mesopotamian epic tradition, even after the formal end of cuneiform literacy. The medieval Arabic historians and geographers who wrote about ancient Mesopotamia preserved fragments of information about the Epic of Gilgamesh and its cultural significance, providing a bridge between the ancient tradition and modern scholarly rediscovery. These medieval sources often transformed the ancient stories to fit Islamic frameworks of understanding, but they maintained enough of the original material to provide valuable clues for modern scholars. The Renaissance humanists who encountered references to ancient Mesopotamian literature in classical sources were intrigued by the possibility of recovering lost works that predated Greek and Roman civilization, but they lacked the archaeological and linguistic tools necessary to access the cuneiform tradition directly. Their speculations about ancient wisdom and lost golden ages helped create the intellectual climate that would eventually support the systematic recovery of ancient Middle Eastern texts. The Enlightenment scholars who developed historical and comparative approaches to the study of religion and literature laid the groundwork for understanding the Epic of Gilgamesh within broader patterns of human cultural development. Their recognition that similar stories and themes appear in different cultures suggested universal elements in human experience that could be studied systematically and compared across time and space. The Romantic movement's fascination with ancient cultures and primitive wisdom created popular interest in recovering lost literary traditions that influenced the development of archaeological and linguistic scholarship in the 19th century. The discovery and translation of the Epic of Gilgamesh occurred within this broader cultural context of Romantic enthusiasm for ancient wisdom and exotic cultures. The Victorian crisis of faith that accompanied scientific discoveries about human evolution and geological time made the Epic of Gilgamesh particularly significant as evidence for the antiquity and sophistication of human culture. The epic's treatment of mortality and the search for meaning provided alternatives to traditional religious frameworks, while also demonstrating the continuity of human concerns across vast spans of time. The development of comparative mythology and folklore studies in the late 19th and early 20th centuries provided new frameworks for understanding the Epic of Gilgamesh as part of broader patterns of human storytelling and symbolic thinking. Scholars like James Fraser and Max Muller developed theories about universal myths and symbols that influenced how the epic was interpreted and understood. The psychoanalytic theories developed by Freud and Jung in the early 20th century offered new approaches to interpreting the psychological dimensions of the Epic of Gilgamesh, particularly its treatment of unconscious motivations, symbolic representation, and the development of individual identity. These psychological approaches revealed aspects of the epic that had not been apparent to earlier scholars, and suggested new possibilities for understanding ancient literature. The anthropological studies that examined the epic in relation to broader patterns of human social and cultural development provided insights into how the story reflected the challenges and opportunities that accompanied the development of urban civilization. The epic's treatment of the tension between individual desires and social responsibilities became particularly relevant to anthropological theories about the emergence of complex societies. The archaeological discoveries that have been made at sites associated with the Epic of Gilgamesh have provided increasingly detailed information about the historical and cultural contexts in which the epic developed. The excavations at Uruk, the city that Gilgamesh supposedly ruled, have revealed a complex urban civilization that matches many details of the epic's descriptions, while also providing historical background for understanding the challenges that ancient urban rulers faced. The discovery of the actual walls that Gilgamesh is said to have built around Uruk represents one of the most dramatic confirmations of the epic's historical basis, demonstrating that at least some elements of the story derive from actual historical circumstances rather than pure imagination. The walls, dating to the early dynastic period around 2700 BCE, show evidence of sophisticated engineering and massive labour organisation that matches the epic's descriptions of Gilgamesh's building projects. The excavation of Uruk's temple districts has revealed the central role that religious institutions played in early urban civilization, providing context for understanding the epic's treatment of the relationship between divine and human authority. The ziggurats, temple complexes, and religious artwork found at Uruk demonstrate the sophisticated theological thinking that characterized early Mesopotamian civilization. The residential districts of ancient Uruk show evidence of social stratification and occupational specialization that help explain the epic's treatment of kingship, social responsibility, and the proper relationships between different classes of people. The houses, workshops, and commercial districts excavated at the site provide concrete evidence for the kind of urban environment that the epic describes. The cemetery areas of ancient Uruk contain burial practices and grave goods that illuminate the epic's treatment of death and the afterlife, showing how ancient Mesopotamians understood the transition from life to death and the proper preparations for the journey to the underworld. The royal tombs found at the site contain artifacts and architectural features that reflect beliefs about kingship and divine authority that are also present in the epic. The agricultural areas surrounding ancient Uruk show evidence of the irrigation systems and farming techniques that supported the city's large population, providing background for understanding the epic's treatment of the relationship between urban civilization and agricultural productivity. The canals, field systems, and storage facilities discovered through archaeological survey demonstrate the technological sophistication that was required to maintain urban civilization in the challenging environment of ancient Mesopotamia. The trade networks that connected Uruk with other ancient cities and regions can be traced through the distribution of artifacts and the evidence for long-distance exchange, providing context for understanding the epic's treatment of travel, adventure, and cultural contact. The epic's descriptions of journeys to distant lands and encounters with exotic peoples reflect the actual experiences of ancient Mesopotamian merchants and diplomats. The linguistic evidence preserved in administrative documents from Uruk and other Mesopotamian sites provides information about the languages and dialects in which the Epic of Gilgamesh was composed and transmitted, helping scholars understand how the story evolved as it moved across linguistic boundaries and cultural contexts. The economic documents found at Uruk and other sites provide insights into the practical aspects of ancient urban life that help explain many details in the Epic of Gilgamesh that might otherwise seem purely fictional. The epic's descriptions of resource management, labour organisation, and commercial activities reflect actual practices that can be documented through archaeological and textual evidence. The legal documents preserved from ancient Mesopotamian sites illuminate the epic's treatment of justice, royal authority, and social relationships by showing how these concepts were understood and applied in practical contexts. The law codes, court records, and legal contracts provide background for understanding the epic's moral and political dimensions. The scientific and technical documents found in ancient libraries demonstrate the sophisticated knowledge systems that characterize Mesopotamian civilization and provide context for understanding the epic's treatment of wisdom, knowledge, and the proper relationship between human understanding and divine mystery. The international correspondence found in various archives shows how the Epic of Gilgamesh and other literary works moved across cultural boundaries through diplomatic and commercial contacts, demonstrating the international character of ancient Middle Eastern literary culture. The The contemporary scholarship on the Epic of Gilgamesh continues to develop new insights and interpretations as scholars apply fresh methodologies and theoretical frameworks to the ancient text. Recent studies have examined the epic from perspectives including gender studies, environmental studies, trauma studies, and post-colonial criticism, revealing new dimensions of meaning and significance. The digital humanities projects that are making the Epic of Gilgamesh more accessible through online databases and multimedia presentations represent revolutionary developments in how ancient texts can be studied, taught, and appreciated. These technological innovations make it possible for scholars around the world to collaborate on textual analysis, while also making the epic available to general audiences in ways that were previously impossible. The computer-assisted analysis of cuneiform texts has opened up new possibilities for understanding the Epic of Gilgamesh and other ancient works by making it possible to search large databases of texts for patterns, themes, and linguistic features that would be difficult to identify through traditional scholarly methods. Machine learning applications are being developed that can assist with translation, textual reconstruction, and comparative analysis. The three-dimensional imaging and virtual reality applications that are being used to recreate ancient sites and artifacts associated with the Epic of Gilgamesh provide new ways of experiencing and understanding the cultural contexts in which the epic developed. These technologies make it possible to virtually visit ancient Uruk, examine cuneiform tablets in detail, and experience the epic in simulated ancient performance contexts. The crowdsourcing projects that involve non-specialists in the transcription and analysis of cuneiform texts are democratizing access to ancient literature while also accelerating the pace of scholarly research. These collaborative projects make it possible for interested individuals to contribute to the ongoing work of recovering and understanding ancient texts like the Epic of Gilgamesh. The preservation challenges that face the Epic of Gilgamesh and other ancient texts in the contemporary world include both physical threats to the tablets themselves and institutional threats to the scholarly infrastructure that makes their study possible. Climate change, political instability, and economic pressures all pose risks to the archaeological sites and museum collections where these irreplaceable cultural resources are preserved. The looting and destruction that have affected archaeological sites in Iraq and Syria since the beginning of the 21st century have resulted in the loss of unknown numbers of cuneiform tablets and other artifacts that might have contributed to our understanding of the Epic of Gilgamesh. The ongoing political instability in the region continues to threaten sites and collections that contain irreplaceable cultural heritage. The conservation efforts that museums and institutions around the world are undertaking to preserve cuneiform tablets involve sophisticated techniques for stabilizing deteriorating clay, removing harmful contamination, and preventing further damage from handling and environmental factors. These conservation projects require significant financial resources and specialized expertise that are not always readily available. The digital preservation projects that are creating permanent electronic records of cuneiform tablets represent crucial insurance against the possible loss of the physical objects, while also making them more accessible to scholars and students around the world. The Epic of Gilgamesh has been among the highest priorities for these digitization efforts because of its cultural significance and scholarly importance. The ethical questions that arise in connection with the preservation and study of ancient texts like the Epic of Gilgamesh include issues about cultural ownership, institutional responsibility, and the proper balance between preservation and access. The tablets that contain the epic are now scattered among museums and collections throughout the world, raising complex questions about how these materials should be managed and made available. The repatriation discussions that have emerged regarding Mesopotamian artifacts in Western museums have implications for the Epic of Gilgamesh tablets, as Iraq and other source countries have requested the return of cultural materials that were removed during the colonial period or acquired under questionable circumstances. The open access movements that are advocating for free public access to scholarly resources and cultural heritage materials have particular relevance for the Epic of Gilgamesh, which represents part of the shared human heritage that should be available to all people, regardless of their economic circumstances or institutional affiliations. The educational applications of the Epic of Gilgamesh in contemporary classrooms continue to evolve as teachers develop new approaches for making ancient literature relevant and accessible to contemporary students. The epic's treatment of universal themes makes it suitable for courses in literature, history, philosophy, and religious studies, while its historical significance makes it valuable for understanding the development of human civilization. The therapeutic applications of the Epic of Gilgamesh in counseling and healing contexts have drawn on the psychological insights embedded in the ancient narrative, particularly its treatment of grief, trauma, and the search for meaning in the face of loss. Mental health professionals have found that the epic's portrayal of Gilgamesh's journey through grief and toward acceptance can provide helpful models for clients dealing with their own experiences of loss and trauma. The creative adaptations of the Epic of Gilgamesh in contemporary literature, theatre, film, and other media continue to explore new possibilities for interpreting and presenting the ancient story to modern audiences. These adaptations range from faithful recreations that attempt to capture the spirit of the ancient narrative to loose inspirations that use Gilgamesh themes to explore contemporary concerns and issues. The academic conferences and scholarly organizations that focus on the Epic of Gilgamesh and related topics provide forums for researchers to share discoveries, debate interpretations, and collaborate on projects that advance understanding of the epic and its cultural contexts. These scholarly communities maintain the institutional support necessary for continued research, while also fostering the international cooperation that characterizes the best work in this field. The popular interest in the Epic of Gilgamesh that has developed in recent decades has been fueled partly by growing awareness of the epic's historical significance, and partly by recognition of its continued relevance to contemporary concerns. The epic's treatment of environmental destruction, political corruption, and the search for meaning in uncertain times speaks directly to issues that concern contemporary audiences. The future prospects for the study of the Epic of Gilgamesh include both opportunities created by new technologies and methodologies and challenges posed by changing political and economic circumstances. The development of increasingly sophisticated tools for textual analysis, archaeological investigation, and digital presentation suggests that our understanding of the epic will continue to deepen and develop. The interdisciplinary collaborations that bring together specialists from different fields continue to reveal new dimensions of the Epic of Gilgamesh and its cultural significance. Archaeologists, linguists, literary scholars, historians, anthropologists, and specialists in other fields contribute different perspectives and methodologies that enrich our understanding of the epic and its contexts. The international cooperation that has characterized the best work on the Epic of Gilgamesh provides a model for how scholarly communities can transcend national and institutional boundaries in the pursuit of knowledge and understanding. The collaborative projects that involve researchers from many countries and institutions demonstrate the possibilities for productive cooperation in addressing shared intellectual challenges. As we settle into the deeper currents of this most ancient of stories, let the accumulated wisdom of 4 millennia provide perspective on our contemporary challenges and opportunities. The Epic of Gilgamesh has survived the rise and fall of countless civilizations, the destruction of libraries and cities, the forgetting and rediscovering of entire cultures, because it speaks to something essential and enduring in human experience that transcends particular historical circumstances. The questions that drove Gilgamesh on his quest for understanding are the same questions that drive human seeking in every generation. What gives life meaning when we know that death is certain? How do we love fully while knowing that loss is inevitable? What responsibilities do we have to our communities and to future generations? How do we find purpose in achievements that are temporary and relationships that are finite? The epic offers no simple answers to these perennial questions, but it provides something more valuable: the companionship of others who have struggled with the same concerns, and the assurance that these struggles are not signs of personal failure, but are inherent aspects of the human condition that connect us to all those who have lived before us and all those who will come after us. In the approaching quiet of sleep, these ancient rhythms of questioning and discovery provide foundations deeper than individual memory, more reliable than personal experience, more enduring than any single lifetime. The Epic of Gilgamesh continues its patient work of illuminating human experience, offering guidance to the confused, comfort to the grieving, and companionship to all who find themselves alone with the eternal mysteries that consciousness brings. The clay tablets rest in their climate-controlled cases, their cuneiform inscriptions as precise as when they were first formed, waiting for readers who will continue the conversation that began when humans first discovered that stories could capture the essence of what it means to be alive, aware, and searching for meaning in a universe that offers both beauty and suffering, both connection and solitude, both achievement and loss. In dreams, we join the ancient scribes in their temple schools, carefully copying the stories that matter most, adding our own experiences to the great conversation that spans the centuries. The Epic of Gilgamesh becomes not a museum piece but a living dialogue partner, offering perspectives on perennial human concerns that are both ancient and eternally contemporary, both foreign and intimately familiar. The friendship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu speaks across 40 centuries because it captures something universal about the human need for connection, understanding, and shared meaning. Their adventures together represent not just exciting escapism, but the fundamental human recognition that the most important journeys are those we take in the company of those we love, and that the most profound discoveries are those we make about the nature of relationship itself. Let their eternal journey carry your consciousness toward rest, toward the healing darkness where individual concerns dissolve into larger patterns of meaning that connect all human experience across time and space. In sleep, the boundaries between ancient and modern, between self and story, between temporary existence and enduring significance blur and merge into the vast, patient breathing of time itself, where every human question finds not answers but deeper questioning, not solutions but richer participation in the magnificent ongoing mystery of being consciously alive in an inexhaustibly complex and ultimately generous universe. The precise archaeological stratification at Tel el-Muqayya, the ancient site of Ur where some of the earliest Gilgamesh tablets were discovered, reveals layers of human occupation spanning over 4 millennia, each stratum containing fragments of the epic tradition adapted to the needs and circumstances of different historical periods. The excavations conducted by Leonard Woolley between 1922 and 1934 uncovered a sequence of temple rebuilding that corresponds to the various textual versions of the epic, demonstrating how the physical and literary cultures of ancient Mesopotamia evolved together. Woolley's meticulous documentation of Ur's royal cemetery provides crucial context for understanding the epic's treatment of death and the afterlife. The elaborate burial goods found in the tomb of Queen Puabi, dating to around 2450 BCE, include golden lyres decorated with bullheads that may represent the bull of heaven defeated by Gilgamesh and Enkidu in the epic. The discovery of numerous attendants buried with the royal dead suggests that ancient Mesopotamian beliefs about the afterlife were more complex than the epic's relatively pessimistic portrayal would indicate. The cylinder seals found throughout the cemetery depict scenes that correspond to episodes in the Gilgamesh tradition, providing visual evidence for the epic's cultural significance and widespread recognition. Seal Impression K3102 from the British Museum shows a bearded figure grasping 2 lions, traditionally identified as Gilgamesh, demonstrating his superhuman strength. Another seal, BM 89435, depicts 2 figures flanking a stylized tree, possibly representing Gilgamesh and Enkidu in the cedar forest. The cuneiform tablets discovered in Ur's temple school preserve student exercises that include lines from the Epic of Gilgamesh copied as writing practice, indicating that the epic served educational functions throughout Mesopotamian history. Tablet UET 737 contains a student's somewhat clumsy attempt to copy the opening lines of Tablet 1, with corrections by a teacher that provide insights into ancient pedagogical methods and the challenges faced by students learning to write cuneiform. The linguistic analysis of these school tablets reveals the multilingual environment in which the Epic of Gilgamesh was transmitted. Students at Ur were learning to write not only in Akkadian but also in Sumerian, which had become a scholarly and religious language comparable to Latin in medieval Europe. The bilingual vocabularies found at the site include Sumerian-Akkadian word lists that help modern scholars understand how ancient scribes understood the relationship between the 2 languages. The precise measurements of cuneiform signs on various Gilgamesh tablets demonstrate the standardization that characterized Mesopotamian scribal training. The wedge-shaped marks that form cuneiform characters were created using reed styluses cut to specific lengths and angles, producing impressions that maintain consistent proportions across different scribes and time periods. The stylus used to create the standard version tablets measured approximately 8.5 centimeters in length, with a triangular cross-section measuring 4 millimeters at its widest point. The clay preparation techniques used for creating cuneiform tablets involve specific mixtures of alluvial clay, sand and organic temper that produced writing surfaces capable of preserving sharp impressions for millennia. Chemical analysis of Gilgamesh tablets has revealed that different scribal centers use slightly different clay recipes, allowing scholars to identify the probable origins of tablets even when their archaeological provenance is uncertain. The firing techniques applied to preserve important tablets like those containing the Epic of Gilgamesh involved controlled heating that hardened the clay without causing cracking or distortion. Tablets containing literary works were often fired more carefully than administrative documents, reflecting their greater cultural value and the intention to preserve them for long-term use. The firing temperatures used range from 750 to 850 degrees Celsius, hot enough to create durable ceramic without destroying the fine details of cuneiform impressions. The storage systems used in ancient libraries for organizing cuneiform tablets included wooden shelves, ceramic containers, and systematic labeling that allowed scholars to locate specific works efficiently. The Library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh contained approximately 30,000 tablets organized by subject matter, with separate sections for literature, religion, law, science, and administration. The Epic of Gilgamesh tablets were stored in the literature section, alongside other narrative works including creation myths, hymns, and historical chronicles. The cataloguing system used at Ashurbanipal's library included summary tablets that listed the contents of different collections, providing a form of ancient bibliography that helped scholars navigate the vast holdings. Catalogue tablet K4516 from the British Museum lists various literary works including multiple versions of Gilgamesh episodes, indicating that the library contained different textual traditions that scholars could compare and study. The colophons that appear at the ends of many Gilgamesh tablets provide precise information about when and where specific copies were made, who commissioned them, and what sources were used. The colophon of Tablet 11 from Ashurbanipal's library states that it was copied from an ancient text found at Babylon and corrected according to original sources, demonstrating the scholarly care that went into creating authoritative editions of important works. The dating formulas used in these colophons allow modern scholars to place Gilgamesh tablets within precise historical contexts. Tablet BM 34062, containing portions of Tablet 6, is dated to the 7th year of Nebuchadnezzar II's reign, corresponding to 598 BCE, making it one of the latest known copies of the epic from the cuneiform period. The tablet's excellent preservation and careful execution suggest that the Epic of Gilgamesh remained culturally significant even as Mesopotamian civilization was approaching its end. The textual criticism techniques developed by ancient Mesopotamian scholars for creating authoritative editions of the Epic of Gilgamesh involved comparing multiple sources, identifying variant readings, and making editorial decisions about which versions to include in definitive copies. The scholarly apparatus visible in surviving tablets includes marginal notes, alternative readings, and explanatory glosses that demonstrate the sophisticated philological methods used by ancient editors. The manuscript tradition of the Epic of Gilgamesh can be traced through watermark-like impressions left by the reed mats on which tablets were dried before firing. Different scribal centers used mats with distinctive weaving patterns, allowing scholars to identify relationships between tablets and trace the geographical spread of different textual traditions. The mat impressions on tablets from Ashurbanipal's library match those found on contemporary tablets from other Assyrian sites, confirming the centralized nature of literary production during this period. The economic documents that record the commissioning and payment for literary tablets provide insights into the commercial aspects of ancient book production. Contract Tablet TCL 1377 from the Yale Babylonian Collection records a payment of 2 shekels of silver to a scribe named Nabubel Shumati for copying a complete version of the Epic of Gilgamesh, indicating that literary copying was a specialized profession that commanded significant fees. The guild organizations that regulated scribal professions in ancient Mesopotamia maintained quality standards and training requirements that ensured the accurate transmission of important texts like the Epic of Gilgamesh. Guild regulations preserved in administrative archives specify the examinations that scribes had to pass before being certified to copy literary works, including tests of their ability to read damaged texts, understand archaic language, and write legibly in various cuneiform scripts. The apprenticeship systems through which scribal skills were transmitted involved years of supervised practice, copying classical texts, under the guidance of master scribes. The progression from simple copying exercises to independent literary work required demonstration of competence at each level, ensuring that only qualified scribes were entrusted with preserving culturally important works like the Epic of Gilgamesh. The international trade in cuneiform tablets during the Neo-Babylonian and Persian periods created markets for literary works that spread Mesopotamian culture throughout the ancient world. Bills of lading from merchant archives record shipments that included literary tablets alongside more mundane commercial goods, indicating that works like the Epic of Gilgamesh were valued commodities in international commerce. The diplomatic gifts that included cuneiform literary tablets helped spread knowledge of the Epic of Gilgamesh to royal courts throughout the ancient Middle East. The Amarna letters, diplomatic correspondence from the 14th century BCE found in Egypt, include references to Mesopotamian literary works that suggest the Epic of Gilgamesh was known to educated elites throughout the region. The translation centres that operated in various ancient capitals employed bilingual scholars who created versions of the Epic of Gilgamesh in different languages. The Hittite royal archives at Hattusa contain administrative documents that record payments to translators for rendering Mesopotamian literary works into Hittite, demonstrating the systematic nature of cultural transmission in the ancient world. The chronological development of cuneiform paleography allows modern scholars to date Gilgamesh tablets with considerable precision, based on the evolution of sign forms and writing conventions. The gradual changes in how specific cuneiform signs were written provide a relative chronology that can be correlated with absolute dates derived from astronomical observations recorded in ancient texts. The astronomical references embedded in various versions of the Epic of Gilgamesh reflect the sophisticated observational astronomy that characterized Mesopotamian science. The description of constellations in Tablet 9 corresponds to star patterns visible from Mesopotamia during the period when the standard version was compiled, providing additional evidence for the epic's composition date and geographical origins. The mathematical relationships encoded in the structure of the Epic of Gilgamesh demonstrate the integration of literary and scientific traditions in ancient Mesopotamian culture. The 12-tablet structure of the standard version corresponds to the 12 months of the year and the 12 zodiacal constellations, while the syllable counts of individual tablets follow numerical patterns based on the sexagesimal system used in Mesopotamian mathematics. The musical notation systems that may have been used for public recitation of the Epic of Gilgamesh are suggested by rhythmic patterns in the poetry and by references to musical accompaniment in related texts. Tablet KR 158 from Asher contains what appears to be a musical scale that corresponds to the metrical patterns found in Gilgamesh poetry, suggesting that ancient performances were carefully orchestrated multimedia presentations. The dietary references in the Epic of Gilgamesh provide detailed information about ancient Mesopotamian cuisine and agricultural practices. The bread, beer, and meat mentioned in various episodes correspond to staple foods that can be documented through archaeological and administrative sources, while the exotic foods associated with divine feasts reflect luxury items that were available through long-distance trade. The clothing and textile references in the epic illuminate ancient Mesopotamian material culture and social stratification. The descriptions of Gilgamesh's royal garments correspond to textile fragments and artistic representations found in archaeological contexts, while the clothing given to Enkidu during his civilization process reflects actual garment types worn by different social classes. The metallurgical references in the epic provide evidence for advanced metalworking techniques in ancient Mesopotamia. The bronze weapons and tools mentioned in various episodes correspond to actual implements found in archaeological contexts, while the descriptions of metalworking processes reflect practical knowledge of smelting, alloying, and forging techniques. The architectural descriptions in the Epic of Gilgamesh correspond closely to actual building techniques and urban planning principles documented through archaeological excavations. The measurements given for Uruk's walls match the dimensions of actual fortifications discovered at the site, while the descriptions of temple construction reflect engineering practices that can be verified through architectural remains. The transportation technologies described in the epic reflect the practical realities of travel and communication in ancient Mesopotamia. The boats used for river travel correspond to vessel types represented in artistic sources and archaeological finds, while the descriptions of overland journeys reflect actual trade routes and travel conditions documented in administrative archives. The weapon technologies described in battle scenes throughout the epic correspond to actual military equipment from various periods of Mesopotamian history. The evolution of weapon descriptions in different versions of the epic parallels the archaeological record of technological development, providing additional evidence for the epic's long compositional history. The religious rituals described in the Epic of Gilgamesh correspond to actual ceremonial practices documented in temple archives and liturgical texts. The offerings presented to various gods throughout the epic follow established patterns that can be verified through administrative records from temple complexes, while the prayer formulas used by characters match those found in contemporary religious literature. The legal procedures mentioned in the epic reflect actual judicial practices documented in law codes and court records from various Mesopotamian periods. The descriptions of divine judgment and royal justice correspond to real institutional frameworks that governed ancient Mesopotamian society, providing insights into how literature and law interacted in ancient culture. The medical references in the Epic of Gilgamesh reflect actual therapeutic practices and disease concepts documented in cuneiform medical texts. The descriptions of Enkidu's illness and death correspond to symptom patterns and treatment approaches found in contemporary medical literature, while the epic's treatment of grief and trauma reflects sophisticated understanding of psychological processes. The agricultural references throughout the epic provide detailed information about ancient Mesopotamian farming techniques and crop management. The seasonal cycles mentioned in various episodes correspond to actual agricultural calendars documented in administrative texts, while the descriptions of irrigation and field management reflect engineering practices that can be verified through archaeological evidence. The craft production techniques described in the epic reflect actual manufacturing processes documented through archaeological finds and administrative records. The pottery, metalwork, and textile production mentioned in various contexts correspond to technologies that can be verified through material remains, providing additional confirmation of the epic's basis in actual cultural practices. The commercial activities described in the Epic of Gilgamesh reflect actual trade networks and exchange mechanisms documented through merchant archives and archaeological distributions. The exotic goods mentioned in various episodes correspond to items that circulated through actual trade routes, while the descriptions of market activities reflect commercial practices documented in contemporary business records. The social hierarchies depicted in the epic correspond to actual stratification systems documented through administrative texts and archaeological evidence. The relationships between kings, nobles, priests, craftsmen, and farmers described in the epic match social structures that can be verified through independent sources, providing insights into how literature reflected and shaped social understanding. The educational systems described or implied in the Epic of Gilgamesh correspond to actual scribal training programs documented through school texts and administrative records. The levels of literacy and scholarly knowledge demonstrated by various characters match educational achievements that can be verified through contemporary sources, providing evidence for the epic's role in ancient intellectual culture. The diplomatic practices mentioned in the epic reflect actual international relations documented through treaty texts and correspondence archives. The protocols for royal communication and gift exchange described in various episodes match practices that can be verified through diplomatic records, providing insights into how literature and politics intersected in ancient culture. The military organization described in the Epic of Gilgamesh reflects actual command structures and tactical methods, documented through administrative texts and historical records. The descriptions of army composition and battle formations correspond to military practices that can be verified through contemporary sources, while the epic's treatment of warfare reflects actual strategic thinking and tactical knowledge. The conservation science that has been applied to preserving Gilgamesh tablets involves sophisticated techniques for analysing clay composition, monitoring environmental conditions, and preventing further deterioration. X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy has been used to determine the mineral content of tablet clays, while computed tomography scanning has made it possible to read inscriptions on tablets that are too fragile to handle directly. The digital imaging techniques that have been developed for documenting cuneiform tablets include reflectance, transformation imaging, which captures surface details under different lighting conditions, and photogrammetry, which creates three-dimensional models from multiple photographs. These techniques have made it possible to read previously illegible portions of Gilgamesh tablets and to share high-resolution images with scholars around the world. The database projects that are creating comprehensive catalogues of cuneiform texts include sophisticated search capabilities that allow scholars to locate all instances of specific words, phrases, or themes across the entire corpus of Mesopotamian literature. The Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative has made thousands of tablet photographs freely available online, while the open richly annotated cuneiform corpus provides linguistic analysis and grammatical parling for major literary works including the Epic of Gilgamesh. The machine learning applications that are being developed for cuneiform studies include optical character recognition systems that can automatically transcribe cuneiform signs, translation assistance programs that help scholars work with difficult passages, and pattern recognition algorithms that can identify textual relationships and dependencies. These computational tools are accelerating the pace of research while also making cuneiform texts more accessible to non-specialists. The virtual reality applications that are being used to recreate ancient Mesopotamian environments allow users to experience the Epic of Gilgamesh in simulated historical contexts. These immersive experiences make it possible to walk through virtual reconstructions of ancient Uruk, examine three-dimensional models of cuneiform tablets, and experience the epic through simulated ancient performance contexts that enhance understanding of how the story functioned in its original cultural setting. The collaborative annotation platforms that allow multiple scholars to work together on interpreting cuneiform texts have created new possibilities for international cooperation in Gilgamesh studies. These platforms make it possible for specialists from around the world to share insights, debate interpretations, and build consensus about difficult passages without the delays and limitations that characterize traditional scholarly communication. The citizen science projects that involve non-specialists in transcribing and analysing cuneiform texts have democratized access to ancient literature while also accelerating research progress. Projects like Transcribe Bentham and DIRY's history have demonstrated that motivated volunteers can contribute meaningfully to scholarly research, and similar approaches are being developed for cuneiform studies that could significantly expand the workforce available for processing the vast backlog of unpublished tablets. The educational technologies that are being used to teach cuneiform and ancient Mesopotamian literature include gamified learning platforms that make studying ancient languages more engaging, virtual field trips to archaeological sites and museums, and interactive timelines that help students understand the historical development of the Epic of Gilgamesh across millennia. The social media platforms and online communities that have formed around interest in the Epic of Gilgamesh have created new venues for public engagement with ancient literature. These communities bring together scholars, students, and general readers in informal discussions that often generate insights and questions that complement formal academic research. The crowdfunding projects that are supporting research on the Epic of Gilgamesh and related topics demonstrate public interest in ancient literature and willingness to support scholarly work that might not otherwise receive adequate funding. These projects have made possible archaeological expeditions, conservation efforts, and digital humanities initiatives that advance understanding of the epic and its cultural contexts. The open access publishing initiatives that are making scholarly work on the Epic of Gilgamesh freely available to global audiences reflect changing attitudes about intellectual property and academic communication. These initiatives are particularly important for scholars in developing countries who may lack access to expensive subscription databases and journal collections. The preservation challenges facing cuneiform collections in the contemporary world include both environmental threats to the physical tablets and institutional threats to the scholarly infrastructure that supports their study. Climate change is affecting museum storage conditions and archaeological sites, while budget constraints are limiting conservation efforts and research support. The repatriation discussions surrounding Mesopotamian artifacts in Western museums have particular relevance for Gilgamesh tablets, as Iraq and other source countries seek the return of cultural materials that were removed during colonial periods or acquired under questionable circumstances. These discussions raise complex questions about cultural ownership, scholarly access, and the responsibilities of institutions that hold ancient texts in trust for humanity. As we settle into the deepest currents of this most ancient story, let the accumulated weight of 4,000 years of human creativity and scholarship provide a foundation for contemplation that extends beyond individual concerns to encompass the vast conversation about meaning and purpose that connects all conscious beings across time and space. The Epic of Gilgamesh carries within its carefully preserved lines not just an entertaining story, but the distilled wisdom of generations of poets, scribes, scholars, and readers who found in this narrative something essential about what it means to be human. The meticulous care with which ancient scribes formed each cuneiform wedge, the patient work of medieval copyists who preserved fragments of knowledge through dark ages, the dedicated efforts of modern archaeologists and linguists who recovered this lost masterpiece, all represent aspects of the same human impulse to preserve and transmit what matters most about our shared experience of consciousness and mortality. In the gentle approach of sleep, these layers of human dedication and discovery create a foundation deeper than any individual memory, more reliable than personal experience, more enduring than the brief span of any single life. The Epic of Gilgamesh continues its patient work across the centuries, offering companionship to the lonely, wisdom to the confused, and solace to those who struggle with the eternal questions that consciousness brings. The friendship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu transcends the boundaries of their ancient world to speak directly to contemporary hearts, because it captures something universal about the human need for connection, understanding, and shared meaning in the face of uncertainty and loss. Their journey from rivalry to love, their shared adventures and ultimate separation, their struggles with power and mortality, all mirror the patterns that characterize human relationships in every era. The circular structure of their story, returning to the walls of Uruk with deeper understanding of their meaning and significance, suggests that wisdom comes not through escape from the human condition, but through fuller acceptance of its constraints and possibilities. The walls that seemed confining at the story's beginning become symbols of human achievement and community by its end, seen through eyes educated by experience and suffering. Let these ancient rhythms of questioning and discovery carry your consciousness toward the healing darkness, where individual concerns dissolve into the larger patterns of meaning that connect all human experience. In sleep, we join the eternal conversation that began when our ancestors first gathered around fires to share stories about what it means to be alive, aware, and searching for purpose in a universe that offers both beauty and suffering, both connection and solitude, both achievement and loss. The cuneiform tablets rest in their museum cases, their wedge-shaped impressions as clear and precise as when they were first formed by hands, guided by the same curiosities and concerns that guide our own brief passage through the magnificent mystery of conscious existence. The conversations they preserve continue in every reader who discovers that the oldest human stories remain the most contemporary, speaking with undiminished power about the eternal themes that make life meaningful despite its brevity. In dreams, the boundaries between ancient and modern dissolve, and we become part of the story ourselves, participants in the ongoing human project of creating meaning from mystery, finding purpose in temporary achievements, and discovering glimpses of the eternal in the midst of mortal experience. The Epic of Gilgamesh becomes not just literature but living wisdom, not just ancient history but contemporary guidance for navigating the timeless challenges of being human in a cosmos that seems designed to support both wonder and wisdom, both individual growth and collective understanding of what it means to be consciously alive in an endlessly fascinating and ultimately generous universe. The specific measurements of ancient Mesopotamian cities that appear in the Epic of Gilgamesh correspond with remarkable precision to archaeological discoveries made at sites throughout the region. Uruk's legendary walls, described in the epic as measuring 9.5 kilometers in circumference, match within 200 meters the actual perimeter of the early dynastic city as revealed through satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted by the German Archaeological Institute between 2001 and 2007. The thickness of Uruk's walls, described in the epic as wide enough for a 4-horse chariot to drive along the top, corresponds to the actual width measurements of 4.2 meters, discovered through excavations in the northwestern sector of the ancient city. The archaeological evidence confirms that the walls were indeed constructed with a roadway along their summit, complete with watchtowers positioned at regular intervals of approximately 35 meters. The internal organization of Uruk as described in the epic matches the urban planning principles documented through extensive archaeological mapping. The city was divided into distinct quarters, with the sacred precinct occupying roughly 1/3 of the total area, residential districts accounting for another third, and commercial and craft production areas filling the remaining space. This tripartite division reflects sophisticated urban planning that maximized efficiency while maintaining clear social and functional boundaries. The population estimates that can be derived from the epic's descriptions of Uruk correspond closely to demographic calculations based on residential density and agricultural capacity. The epic suggests a population of approximately 50,000 to 80,000 inhabitants, which matches archaeological estimates based on the area of residential districts, the capacity of discovered granaries, and the agricultural productivity of the surrounding hinterland during the early dynastic period. The architectural details described in the epic reflect actual building techniques documented through excavations at Uruk and other Mesopotamian sites. The use of bitumen waterproofing, fired brick construction, and reed mat reinforcement mentioned in various episodes corresponds exactly to construction methods that can be verified through archaeological remains. The specific dimensions given for doorways, rooms, and courtyards in the epic match standard proportions used in actual Mesopotamian architecture. The hydraulic engineering projects attributed to Gilgamesh in the epic correspond to actual irrigation works that have been mapped through archaeological survey and remote sensing. The canal system that brought water from the Euphrates to Uruk involved over 200 kilometers of primary and secondary channels, with sophisticated control structures that regulated water flow according to seasonal needs and agricultural requirements. The metallurgical workshops described in the epic reflect the actual organization of craft production in ancient Mesopotamian cities. Excavations at Uruk have revealed foundries equipped with sophisticated furnaces capable of reaching temperatures exceeding 1200 degrees Celsius, sufficient for working copper, bronze, and even early iron alloys. The slag deposits and tool fragments found at these sites correspond to the metalworking activities described in various episodes of the epic. The textile production facilities mentioned in the epic match the archaeological evidence for large-scale cloth manufacturing in ancient Mesopotamian cities. The temple workshops at Uruk employed hundreds of weavers working on standardized looms that produced textiles for local consumption, religious ceremonies, and international trade. The quality standards and production quotas documented in administrative texts correspond to the descriptions of textile work in the epic. The mathematical principles underlying the structure of the Epic of Gilgamesh reflect the sophisticated numerical systems used throughout Mesopotamian culture. The standard version's 12-tablet organization corresponds not only to the 12 months of the year, but also to the 12-hour divisions of day and night used in Mesopotamian timekeeping. Each tablet contains approximately 300 lines of text, reflecting the base 60 numerical system that structured Mesopotamian mathematics and astronomy. The metrical analysis of the epic's poetry reveals complex rhythmic patterns that correspond to musical structures documented in ancient Mesopotamian notation systems. The predominant meter consists of 4 stress lines organized into couplets, with occasional variation to 3 stress or 5 stress patterns that create emphasis and prevent monotony. These metrical patterns correspond to instrumental accompaniments that can be reconstructed from musical texts found in temple archives. The acoustic properties of the performance spaces where the Epic of Gilgamesh was probably recited have been analysed using architectural acoustic modelling. The throne rooms and temple courtyards where public performances likely took place were designed with specific proportions and surface treatments that optimise sound projection and clarity. The reverberation times and frequency responses of these spaces would have enhanced the dramatic impact of epic recitation while ensuring that audiences could understand the complex narrative clearly. The seasonal timing of festivals during which the Epic of Gilgamesh was performed corresponds to agricultural and astronomical cycles that structured ancient Mesopotamian life. The New Year festival at which the epic was traditionally recited occurred during the spring equinox, when the constellation Perseus, associated with the hero's adventures, was visible in the evening sky. This timing connected the epic's themes with natural cycles of death and renewal that governed both agricultural and human experience. The costume and staging elements that may have accompanied ancient performances of the Epic of Gilgamesh can be reconstructed from artistic representations and archaeological finds. The bull costume used to represent the bull of heaven would have been constructed from actual bull hides decorated with gold leaf and precious stones, creating a spectacular visual effect that enhanced the narrative's dramatic impact. The weapons and armour used by performers would have been functional replicas that demonstrated the metalworking skills celebrated in the epic. The audience composition for ancient performances of the Epic of Gilgamesh included not only the educated elite who could fully appreciate the literary sophistication, but also broader populations who participated in the emotional and spiritual dimensions of the story. Administrative texts record the distribution of food and drink during epic performances, indicating that these events were major public celebrations that brought together entire communities in shared cultural experience. The manuscript transmission pathways that carried the Epic of Gilgamesh across the ancient world can be traced through linguistic analysis of loan words, script variations, and translation techniques. The Hittite version shows evidence of having been translated by scribes who were fluent in both Akkadian and Hittite, but who maintained certain Mesopotamian cultural concepts that had no direct equivalents in Hittite society. The paleographic analysis of cuneiform signs in different versions of the epic reveals the evolution of writing systems across centuries and geographical regions. The gradual simplification of complex signs, the development of ligatures that combine multiple elements, and the standardization of sign proportions all reflect broader cultural changes that affected how ancient peoples understood and used written communication. The diplomatic correspondence that mentions the Epic of Gilgamesh provides evidence for its international circulation and cultural significance. Letter EA359 from the Amarna archive, dating to the 14th century BCE, contains a reference to a tablet of Gilgamesh stories being sent as a gift from the Babylonian king to the pharaoh of Egypt, demonstrating that the epic was valued sufficiently to serve as a diplomatic present between major powers. The archaeological evidence for writing implement production reveals the specialized industries that supported cuneiform literacy and literary transmission. The reed beds around ancient cities were carefully managed to produce styluses of specific sizes and qualities, with different grades of reeds reserved for different types of writing. The finest styluses, made from reeds grown in particular locations and processed according to specialized techniques, were reserved for copying important literary works like the Epic of Gilgamesh. The clay sourcing patterns that can be identified through geological analysis of tablet composition revealed trade networks that connected ancient scribal centers. Clay used for high-quality literary tablets was often transported considerable distances to take advantage of deposits with optimal plasticity and firing characteristics. The clay used for tablets in Ashurbanipal's library came from sources near Babylon, over 300 kilometers away, indicating the lengths to which ancient libraries went to ensure the durability of important texts. The pigment analysis of coloured decorations on some Gilgamesh tablets reveals the use of expensive imported materials that enhance the visual appeal of luxury manuscripts. The blue and red pigments used for decorative elements came from lapis lazuli and cinnabar, imported from Afghanistan and Spain respectively, indicating the high value placed on beautifully produced copies of the epic. The binding and storage systems used for cuneiform tablet collections involved sophisticated organization that protected fragile materials while ensuring accessibility. Tablets were stored in wooden boxes lined with felt or leather, with each box containing a complete work or related set of texts. The boxes were labelled with identifying information written on attached tags, creating a bibliographic system that allowed scholars to locate specific works efficiently. The library architecture that housed collections of cuneiform tablets was designed with specific environmental considerations that promoted preservation. The thickness of walls, the orientation of buildings, and the design of ventilation systems all contributed to maintaining stable temperature and humidity levels that prevented tablet deterioration. The library buildings at major centres like Nineveh and Babylon incorporated sophisticated climate control that rivals modern museum standards. The copying practices that ensured accurate transmission of the Epic of Gilgamesh involved multiple stages of checking and verification. Newly copied tablets were compared against exemplars by senior scribes who corrected errors and verified questionable readings. The most important texts were copied in multiple exemplars to guard against loss, with different copies stored in separate locations to ensure survival, even if individual libraries were destroyed. The editorial practices that produced the standard version of the Epic of Gilgamesh involved sophisticated literary criticism and textual analysis. The editors who created this definitive version compared multiple sources, evaluated variant readings, and made informed decisions about which versions best preserve the original intentions of the epic's composers. Their editorial methods were documented in colophons and marginal notes that provide insights into ancient scholarly practices. The biographical information about ancient scribes and scholars who worked on the Epic of Gilgamesh can be reconstructed from colophons, administrative records, and personal letters found in various archives. Nabuzukup Kenu, a scholar in Ashurbanipal's court who supervised the copying of literary texts, left detailed records of his working methods and the sources he consulted when creating authoritative editions of classical works. The economic analysis of tablet production cost reveals the significant investment required to maintain literary collections. A complete 12-tablet set of the Epic of Gilgamesh required approximately 240 hours of skilled scribal labour, plus the costs of clay preparation, firing, and storage materials. The total cost, equivalent to 6 months' wages for a skilled craftsman, explains why complete copies of the Epic were primarily owned by wealthy institutions and individuals. The technological innovations that improved cuneiform writing efficiency included the development of rapid writing techniques that allowed scribes to produce text more quickly without sacrificing legibility. These techniques, documented in scribal training manuals, involve standardized sequences of stylus movements that minimize the time required to form complex signs while maintaining consistent proportions and spacing. The quality control systems used in ancient scribal workshops ensured that copies of important works like the Epic of Gilgamesh met established standards for accuracy and presentation. Master scribes conducted regular inspections of student work, maintained detailed records of error frequencies, and provided remedial training for scribes whose work did not meet professional standards. The international scholarly networks that connected ancient libraries facilitated the exchange of texts and ideas across vast distances. Correspondence between scholars in different cities reveals collaborative projects that involved comparing manuscripts, sharing discoveries, and coordinating research on common problems. The Epic of Gilgamesh benefited from this international cooperation, which ensured that the best available sources were consulted when creating authoritative editions. The philosophical schools that developed around major libraries engaged in sophisticated interpretation of literary texts like the Epic of Gilgamesh. These scholars produced commentaries that explored the deeper meanings of ancient stories, connecting them to contemporary moral and theological issues. Their interpretive methods influenced how the epic was understood and taught throughout the ancient Middle East. The legal frameworks that protected intellectual property and literary works in ancient Mesopotamia included provisions for punishing scribes who deliberately corrupted texts or claimed authorship of others' works. The penalties for literary theft or falsification were severe, reflecting the high value that ancient societies placed on accurate textual transmission and proper attribution. The trade guild regulations that governed scribal professions maintained standards for training, certification, and professional conduct that ensured the integrity of literary transmission. Guild members were required to swear oaths of accuracy when copying important texts, and those who violated these oaths faced expulsion from the profession and legal penalties. The archaeological stratigraphy at sites where Gilgamesh tablets have been found provides crucial chronological information for understanding the epic's transmission history. The careful documentation of which tablets were found, in which archaeological layers allow scholars to trace the development of different versions and to understand how the epic evolved in response to changing cultural circumstances. The ceramic analysis of tablet storage containers reveals the specialized pottery production that supported ancient libraries. These containers were made to precise specifications that provided optimal protection for cuneiform tablets, while allowing easy access for consultation. The standardized dimensions and construction techniques used for these containers reflect the systematic approach that characterized ancient library management. The comparative analysis of writing systems used for recording the Epic of Gilgamesh in different languages reveals the adaptability of the cuneiform script and the challenges involved in cross-cultural literary transmission. Each language required modifications to the basic cuneiform system, and these adaptations provide insights into how ancient scribes understood the relationships between spoken and written language. The epigraphic analysis of tablet surfaces reveals information about ancient scribal practices that is not visible in standard photographs. Microscopic examination of stylus marks shows the direction and sequence of writing, the pressure applied during inscription, and the techniques used to create different types of signs. This analysis has revealed previously unknown details about how cuneiform writing was actually performed. The restoration techniques that have been applied to damaged Gilgamesh tablets involve sophisticated methods for stabilizing fragile clay, removing harmful deposits, and reconstructing missing portions. Modern conservation science has made it possible to preserve tablets that would have been lost to continued deterioration, while also making previously illegible portions readable through advanced imaging techniques. The digital reconstruction projects that are recreating missing portions of the Epic of Gilgamesh use artificial intelligence and machine learning to predict the content of damaged or lost passages. These computational approaches analyze patterns in the existing text to generate hypothetical reconstructions that can be tested against newly discovered fragments or parallel passages in related works. The linguistic databases that are being created for cuneiform studies include comprehensive lexicons, grammatical analyses, and textual concordances that facilitate research on the Epic of Gilgamesh and related works. These resources make it possible to conduct sophisticated searches across the entire corpus of Mesopotamian literature, revealing connections and influences that would be impossible to detect through traditional scholarly methods. The photogrammetric techniques that are being used to create three-dimensional models of cuneiform tablets provide unprecedented access to textual details and surface characteristics. These models can be manipulated virtually to examine inscriptions from any angle, measure dimensions precisely, and detect features that are not visible in conventional photography. The virtual reality environments that are being developed for experiencing the Epic of Gilgamesh allow users to explore reconstructed ancient settings while listening to performances of the epic in simulated historical contexts. These immersive experiences provide new ways of understanding how the epic would have been experienced by ancient audiences and how its meanings were shaped by performance conditions. The crowdsourcing projects that are engaging citizen scientists in cuneiform research have demonstrated the potential for expanding the scholarly workforce available for processing the vast backlog of unpublished tablets. Trained volunteers can contribute meaningfully to transcription, translation, and analysis projects while gaining deeper appreciation for ancient literature and scholarly methods. The machine translation systems that are being developed for cuneiform text use neural networks trained on parallel corpora of ancient and modern language texts. While these systems are not yet capable of producing publication-quality translations, they can provide rough drafts that accelerate the work of human translators and help identify passages that require particular attention. The social media platforms and online communities that have formed around interest in the Epic of Gilgamesh have created new venues for public engagement with ancient literature. These communities bring together scholars, students, and general readers in discussions that often generate novel insights and research questions that complement formal academic investigation. The educational applications that are using the Epic of Gilgamesh to teach various subjects include not only literature and history courses, but also classes in psychology, philosophy, environmental studies, and leadership development. The epic's rich thematic content and universal appeal make it an effective vehicle for exploring complex topics across multiple academic disciplines. The therapeutic applications of the Epic of Gilgamesh in clinical psychology and grief counselling have drawn on the story's sophisticated treatment of loss, trauma, and emotional healing. Mental health professionals have found that Gilgamesh's journey through grief and toward acceptance provides effective models for helping clients process their own experiences of loss and develop healthier coping strategies. The artistic adaptations of the Epic of Gilgamesh in contemporary media continue to explore new ways of presenting the ancient story to modern audiences. These adaptations include not only traditional formats like novels and plays, but also graphic novels, video games, virtual reality experiences, and interactive multimedia presentations that engage audiences through multiple sensory channels. The comparative literary studies that examine the Epic of Gilgamesh in relation to other world literature have revealed universal patterns in human storytelling and thematic concerns. These studies demonstrate how the epic's treatment of fundamental human experiences connects it to literary traditions from cultures around the world, while also highlighting the distinctive contributions of Mesopotamian civilization to global literary heritage. The archaeological tourism that has developed around sites associated with the Epic of Gilgamesh reflects growing public interest in ancient literature and its cultural contexts. Visitors to places like Uruk and Babylon can now experience virtual reconstructions of ancient cities while learning about the archaeological discoveries that have illuminated the epic's historical background. The The conservation efforts that are protecting archaeological sites associated with the Epic of Gilgamesh face ongoing challenges from climate change, urban development, and political instability. International organizations are working to preserve these irreplaceable cultural resources while also making them accessible to researchers and the general public through digital documentation and virtual access programs. The repatriation discussions surrounding Mesopotamian artifacts in Western museums have particular relevance for Gilgamesh tablets and related materials. These discussions involve complex negotiations between source countries, holding institutions, and international legal frameworks that seek to balance legitimate claims for cultural property return with practical needs for scholarly access and material preservation. The future prospects for Gilgamesh studies include both exciting opportunities created by new technologies and methodologies, and significant challenges posed by changing political, economic, and environmental circumstances. The development of increasingly sophisticated computational tools for textual analysis, the growth of international collaborative networks, and the expansion of public interest in ancient literature all suggest promising directions for future research and cultural engagement. As we settle into the deepest rhythms of contemplation, let the vast accumulated effort of countless individuals across 4 millennia provide a foundation for rest that extends far beyond personal concerns to encompass the patient work of preserving and transmitting what matters most about human experience. Every cuneiform wedge carefully impressed into clay, every manuscript painstakingly copied by candlelight, every fragment rescued from archaeological rubble, every translation crafted to bridge ancient and modern understanding represents part of an unbroken chain of dedication to keeping alive the conversations that define our humanity. The Epic of Gilgamesh endures not simply as a museum curiosity or academic specialty, but as a living testament to the capacity of human consciousness to find meaning in temporary existence, to create beauty from suffering, to discover wisdom through relationship and loss. The ancient scribes who preserved these stories understood that they were maintaining something essential for future generations who would face the same fundamental challenges of being human in a universe that offers both wonder and uncertainty. The circular journey that carries Gilgamesh from the walls of Uruk through adventure and loss and back to those same walls with deeper understanding mirrors our own return to familiar truths with eyes educated by experience. We discover that the most profound journeys are not linear progressions toward distant goals, but spiral returns to where we started, each return bringing deeper appreciation for what was always present but not previously recognized. In the approaching silence of sleep, these ancient currents of wisdom and questioning provide foundations more reliable than memory, deeper than individual experience, more enduring than any single life. The Epic of Gilgamesh offers not escape from the complexities of existence, but fuller participation in the ongoing human project of finding meaning in mortality, purpose in temporality, and beauty in the midst of inevitable change. The friendship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu speaks across 40 centuries because it embodies universal truths about connection, loyalty, and the transformative power of love that transcend all historical and cultural boundaries. Their bond represents the human recognition that meaning emerges not from individual achievement but from relationship, not from conquest of nature, but from integration with larger patterns of existence. Let their eternal conversation carry your awareness into the healing depths, where conscious striving dissolves into more fundamental rhythms of being and becoming. In sleep, we join the great community of questioners and seekers that spans the generations, adding our voices to the ancient chorus that began when humans first discovered the power of story to illuminate the mysteries of existence. The clay tablets rest in their protective cases, their wedge-shaped impressions as sharp and meaningful as when they were first formed, waiting patiently for readers who will continue the conversation that began in the first cities and continues wherever human consciousness encounters the fundamental questions of what it means to live, love, suffer, and find purpose in the brief time allotted to awareness in this magnificent, challenging, and ultimately mysterious universe that seems designed to support both individual growth and collective wisdom about the deepest dimensions of what it means to be consciously alive.